Last time we spoke about the Japanese offensive at Changsha. In late September of 1941, fighting in China had become a brutal struggle of endurance. Japanese forces kept pushing forward, but China, though battered by heavy losses, refused to yield. Help from abroad was slowly beginning to matter. American aid reached China through groups like the Red Cross, and volunteers later associated with the Flying Tigers offered crucial support to Chinese operations. Against this backdrop, Changsha and Hunan became the center of a dangerous autumn campaign. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist leadership treated the city as strategically vital, knowing that its fate could influence the wider course of the war. In the end, the resistance at Changsha showed China's key advantage, that being resilience. The city's defenses helped slow the Japanese advance, break up momentum, and create uncertainty as the campaign continued. This episode is the Autumn Battle of Changsha. Well, hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and could also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Were you in the mood for something not history-related? Over at Echoes of War, we just began a 3-part series looking into the Star Wars Thrawn trilogy. And if you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, you get early access to all the content I make, and voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. In late September of 1941, the war in China had already entered its 5th year. By then, the conflict had lost whatever remained of novelty and had settled into something harsher and more exhausting. It was a long war of attrition fought across enormous distances, under conditions of chronic shortage, strategic uncertainty, and repeated local catastrophe. Japan still possessed formidable military strength. Its armies could still strike hard, move fast, and exploit superior firepower, air support, and communications in individual campaigns. Yet the larger shape of the war had begun to change. China had not collapsed. The nationalist government still stood. China's armies, however battered, still held the field. The line between survival and defeat remained dangerously thin, but it had not broken. And this was a situation in which the autumn campaign in Hunan and Hubei unfolded. The struggle around Changsha did not occur in isolation. It belonged to a wider military and political moment. In Europe, the war had already expanded into a continent-wide convulsion. Germany and the Soviet Union were locked in a massive struggle after the German invasion in June. Leningrad was under threat, Kiev had become the scene of a disaster, and the approach of the Battle of Moscow suggested that still a greater bloodshed would be ahead. Stalin had pressed Churchill to open a second front in Europe, and had been refused. The global balance of war was shifting, but not yet in any way that guaranteed relief to China. In Asia, Japan continued to press forward. The pressure on China remained immense. Yet by mid-1941, China's position, though still precarious, no longer looked quite as desperate as it had in earlier years. International sympathy had grown. Material aid, however limited, was beginning to take more concrete form. In July, the American Red Cross sent China medical supplies worth millions of dollars. In August, more than 100 retired American pilots and mechanics came together to aid China against Japan. The air unit they formed, later celebrated as the Flying Tigers, meant more than aircraft and personnel alone. It signaled that China's war was no longer quite so isolated. That change in atmosphere did not produce calm in Chongqing. It sharpened urgency. For Chiang Kai-shek, the possibility that the international situation might slowly improve for China carried with it a bit of hard implication. China had to endure long enough to benefit from it, That meant surviving, not in abstract terms, but in particular places, against particular offensives, at moments when a local defeat might have consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. In the autumn of 1941, one of those places was Changsha. Changsha had long occupied an outsized place in the military geography of the war. It stood as the capital of Hunan, a hinge between regions, and a vital position in the defense of central China. Its security affected the Xiang River, communications across the province, and the broader defensive posture shielding approaches towards the wartime capital. To lose it, even temporarily, would be more than a symbolic blow. It would threaten the larger balance of the front in south-central China, and test whether Japanese offensives could still force dramatic strategic results. At the same time, the battle for Changsha was not a simple contest between one Chinese army and one Japanese army facing each other across a fixed line. It was part of a larger operational struggle linking the 9th War Zone with supporting actions from the 3rd, 5th, and 6th War Zones. It involved frontal resistance, hurried reinforcement, mobile defense, rear harassment, and the constant effort to turn Japanese momentum into Japanese overextension. Chinese commanders were trying not merely to survive a blow, but to absorb it, stretch it, and eventually strike back against an enemy whose speed could become a liability once supply lines lengthened and formations dispersed. This was the burden resting on the military commission in Chongqing. There, while reports arrived in fragments and maps were revised by the hour, Chiang Kai-shek spent long stretches in the operations room, watching the situation in Hunan and Hubei develop. He had already ordered the various war zones to support the 9th War Zone's operations, and now he followed the campaign with intense concentration. His attention moved repeatedly towards reports from the 6th War Zone and Chen Cheng's counteroffensive towards Yiqiang, for Yiqiang was tied not only to local fighting in Hubei, but also to the defense of the Yangtze approach, and therefore to the security of Chongqing itself. In his mind, Hunan and Hubei had become the focal point of China's war effort in that season. Meanwhile, at the front, the situation was deteriorating fast. Japanese forces pressing into northern Hunan had already imposed severe strain on the Chinese defenses. Blocking units had been battered back. Communications were uncertain. Some formations fought stubbornly but could not hold. Others dissolved more quickly than hoped. The Japanese advance towards Changsha created exactly the kind of crisis Chinese commanders feared most, one in which the enemy moved with enough force and speed to threaten a major city before a coherent defensive response could be reassembled. Chinese units had to be thrown into action as they arrived, often after exhausting marches, often with incomplete knowledge of the situation, and often under immediate pressure from artillery, aircraft, and aggressive infantry assaults. Yet even at this dangerous stage, the campaign contained an opportunity as well as a threat. The deeper Japanese units pushed into Hunan, the more exposed the rear became. Supply depots, transportation lines, and communications stretched farther behind the spearhead. Chinese formations that had been driven aside were not always destroyed. Some remained capable of reappearing to strike roads, depots, and isolate detachments. If Changsha represented the visible center of the struggle, the enemy rear represented its hidden vulnerability. The Chinese aim, therefore, was not simply to defend passively around the city. It was to combine stubborn resistance in front with harassment and disruption behind, so that the Japanese advance would become increasingly difficult to sustain. The battle that followed unfolded under these pressures. A threatened city, a strained but unbroken defense, commanders forced to improvise under severe danger, and a wider international war that made every local decision feel heavier than the ground on which it was undertaken. This subtle improvement in China's larger situation did not mean safety. China was still battered, under-resourced, and vulnerable. Japanese forces still possessed enormous advantages in mobility, firepower, and air power in many sectors. Large parts of the country remained occupied or threatened. Yet, by mid-1941, something in the atmosphere had changed. In July, the American Red Cross sent China medical supplies worth millions of dollars. In August, more than 100 retired American pilots and mechanics came together to aid China in its struggle against Japan. The air unit that they formed would become famous under the name by which China knew them, the Flying Tigers. Their significance exceeded their immediate tactical value. They represented a visible sign that China was not entirely abandoned to isolation. For Claire Chennault, romantic, aggressive, and optimistic by temperament, the new situation encouraged increasingly bold thoughts. For the first time, he included in his planning the idea that Japanese home territory might one day be bombed from bases in China. Such schemes were ambitious and perhaps premature, but their very existence reveals an altered horizon of possibility. A country that imagines striking back is already psychologically in a different position than one concerned only with preventing its own collapse. China had endured 4 harsh years of resistance. It had escaped immediate national destruction. It had preserved a functioning political center. It had maintained armies in the field. It had suffered terribly, but it had not been broken. For Chiang Kai-shek, these changes did not produce calm. They sharpened his determination. A leader under such circumstances could not read every improvement as a reassurance. It could also be read as pressure. If the strategic climate was beginning, however slowly, to tilt in China's favor, then China had to endure long enough to make use of it. That required surviving not abstractly, but in specific places, on specific fronts, in specific campaigns. Through specific days of danger in the autumn of 1941, it looked like Hunan and Hubei became those places. For example, Yichang mattered directly in the fighting in Xiangbei, but it also mattered independently. It was tied to the security of the Yangtze approach and therefore to the defense of Chongqing. It belonged not only to the immediate problem of the battlefield maneuver, but to the larger question of whether China could do more than absorb Japanese offensives. Could Chinese forces exploit enemy overstretch? Could Japanese advances be turned into liabilities? Could local counterattacks and rear harassment generate effects greater than the raw size of forces involved? By September, these questions were no longer hypothetical. They were quite urgent. In Chiang Kai-shek's mind, Hunan and Hubei were now the focal point. The struggle around Changsha was central to that effort. From Chongqing, Chiang Kai-shek telegraphed Commander Shi Yue in the 9th War Zone with instructions that made both the danger and the opportunity plain. The message emphasized that the enemy in northern Hunan, though still pressing hard, had already been bravely intercepted by Chinese units and was now quite exhausted, with lines of advance increasingly difficult to sustain. This, Chiang Kai-shek argued, created an excellent opportunity for Chinese forces to strike at the enemy's rear and seek annihilation rather than mere delay. He urged officers and soldiers alike to remain determined to destroy the enemy. Even if the Japanese troops advanced to the vicinity of Changsha itself, Chinese forces were to renew their efforts, maintain their confidence in victory, and prevent the enemy from establishing any foothold. The telegram also pointed to the broader operational picture. Japanese troops drawn from sectors of the 5th and 6th War Zones had been committed to the invasion of northern Hunan, leaving their rear areas dangerously exposed. The 3rd, 5th, and 6th War Zones had launched supporting offensives on the 23rd. Therefore, the 9th War Zone had to strike resolutely and fiercely, preventing the Japanese from coordinating their forces and frustrating any attempt to occupy Changsha. The message was at once exhortation and operational logic. It reflected the core of Chinese problems in the campaign. The Japanese thrust was dangerous and had to be blocked, but the very speed and depth of that thrust could also expose the attacker. Yet by the time Chiang Kai-shek sent his instructions, the danger around Changsha was already quite severe. After the 74th Army had been beaten back, there was no major Chinese forces north of the city that could confidently block the Japanese advance in a straightforward, stable line. The Japanese 4th Division, together with the Hayabuchi Detachment, had defeated the 95th Division of the Chinese 37th Army, pushed towards Changsha. The prospect that the city might fall, at least temporarily, was no longer remote. In response, Xiao Zhujiang's 79th Army from the 6th War Zone was ordered to move towards the city. Its vanguard was Huang Jiaoben's 98th Division. That movement was a forced march in the literal sense. It was not a flourish of language, but an admission of urgency. Troops were pushed beyond ordinary endurance because there was simply no time to gather strength under favorable conditions. Changsha could not wait for convenience, rest, or ideal concentration. Either reinforcements arrived in time to fight immediately, or they would arrive too late to even matter. Wang Jiaben was no stranger to battle. He was a veteran officer from the Yunnan Army. He had fought the Japanese repeatedly, more than 20 times since the outbreak of the War of Resistance. He belonged to that generation of commanders who had been shaped by the fragmented military politics of Republican China, but whose careers were now being rewritten by the national emergency of the anti-Japanese war. During the First Battle of Changsha, he had already distinguished himself. He had led troops in a counterattack along the Tongcheng Line in southern Hubei and intercepted retreating Japanese forces at Longmengchang and Changshoji, killing more than 1,000 enemy soldiers. He had experience, reputation, and a sense of what it meant to fight in the Changsha theater. This time he marched from Changzhou, driving his division forward with all possible speed. By noon on September the 26th, the 98th Division reached a position about 2 kilometers northeast of Changsha. There was scarcely time to settle the men. No careful preparation was even possible. They had arrived because the city was in danger, and the battle began almost immediately. At dusk, the division engaged the Hayabuchi detachment. The fighting continued until late into the night without any decisive result. That in itself was costly enough. Troops who had just completed a punishing march had already closed in to the limits of their endurance. To be thrown immediately into combat magnified every weakness: thirst, fatigue, confusion, the difficulty of building fieldworks under pressure. What the soldiers of the 90th Division could do that night, they did with their hands and whatever tools they had. They scraped positions out of the earth. They assembled makeshift cover. Officers moved along the line trying to impose order on terrain that had become a battlefield almost as soon as it was occupied. At dawn on September the 27th, the Japanese intensified the pressure from the air. More than 20 aircraft bombed the 98th Division's positions, tearing apart the earthworks that officers and soldiers had spent the night constructing. Bombing had a double effect. Physically, it damaged positions, wounded men, and disrupted preparations. Psychologically, it reminded defenders that they were being observed from above and struck by an enemy against whom they could often do very little against. Immediately after the bombing came a fierce infantry assault. Wang Jiaben and several other commanders went down to their respective regiments to supervise the fighting personally. This was dangerous, but under such circumstances, commanders often believed that presence itself mattered. When fieldworks are collapsing, shell bursts are continuous, and communications are unreliable, authority must sometimes be carried by a body rather than a wire. The defenders held. Again and again, the Japanese attacked. Again and again, they were repulsed only to reorganize and come on once more. Every minute the Chinese line remained in place was bought with blood. Fallen and wounded men were carried rearward in what seemed an endless stream. The cost of resistance accumulated visibly before the eyes of those who were still fighting. By noon, even water could no longer be delivered to the front. That detail reveals the intensity of the battle more clearly than any grander statements could. A line that continued to be supplied even with water had reached a condition of severe strain. During brief pauses in the fighting, officers and soldiers pulled out dry rations and chewed them slowly, swallowing with difficulty while they waited for the next attack. Such moments are amongst the most characteristic in battle, not the long, smooth continuity imagined in peacetime rhetoric, but brief interludes of miserable necessity between explosions. At 2 p.m, the crisis deepened sharply. A unit of the Japanese 4th Division worked its way behind the 90th Division's position and attacked from the rear. This was the kind of tactical development every defending commander dreads. A force can endure heavy frontal pressure if its line remains coherent and its rear reasonably secure. But when the enemy troops appear behind a position, the entire structure of the defense begins. There behind the line were more than 100 Chinese wounded awaiting evacuation. Japanese soldiers attacked with bayonets. One of the wounded Chinese soldiers, already beyond ordinary capacity for resistance, rushed forward and detonated a grenade against a Japanese attacker. It was certainly an act of desperation, but it was also one of defiance. This episode captures something essential about the tone of the Battle of Changsha. This was not a neat engagement between organized lines alone. It was a desperate collision in which even the badly wounded were drawn into the late resistance. For Wang Jiaben, however, the tactical reality was impossible to deny. If he stayed where he was, the division might be completely annihilated. Personal courage could not alter encirclement. Resentfully, bitterly, and under the kind of pressure that leaves permanent scars on a commander's memory, he was forced to order a retreat. When he led the survivors off the battlefield, fewer than half of his men would remain. Reinforcements from another direction now entered the struggle. The Provisional Second Army of the 7th War Zone dispatched the Provisional 8th Division under Zhang Zhongsong. At 7 in the evening on September the 27th, Zheng's forces arrived at Zhoujiatang, on the eastern outskirts of Changsha. Personnel of the 9th War Zone waiting there reported grim news. A Japanese detachment had already entered the city that very afternoon, and another detachment was only 3 kilometers away. The situation invited rash decisions. A commander arriving near a threatened city at dusk with reports that the enemy was already inside may feel compelled to hurl troops forward immediately in a gesture of resolution. Yet night fighting in an urban approach without adequate reconnaissance can turn courage into waste. Zhang Junsong considered the matter very carefully. He concluded that to rush blindly into the city at night would likely produce confusion and heavy losses. Thus, instead, he first sought to strike the enemy outside the city. His troops deployed quietly and crept forward through the darkness, launching a probing attack. But they soon discovered that the Japanese were fully prepared and not vulnerable to easy surprise. The line could not be broken. With no prospect of success, the force had to withdraw. The moment is quite revealing because it shows how narrow the margin had become. Chinese commanders were trying to recover initiative while still groping through uncertainty. Reports were incomplete, Japanese dispositions were difficult to fix, and every hour was quite dangerous. On the evening of September the 28th, the 79th Army's 6th Provisional Division occupied Yelu Mountain west of Changsha. From that height, officers and soldiers looked across the Xiang River towards the city. Changsha, for the first time, was, in fact, in Japanese hands. The emotional force of that sight can only be imagined. Changsha had lived for years under threat. It had been defended, contested, prepared, and feared. The possibility of its loss had hovered over military planning and public consciousness alike. Now the danger had become a fact. A city that stood as an object of effort and anxiety was visibly occupied by the enemy. No single feeling could have governed the men who saw this. For in war, a city seen in enemy hands is not always simply lost. Sometimes it's like a summon. Late that evening, Zhao Jiping, commander of the 6th Provisional Division, received a telegram from Shi Yue. He read it, and then he stood before the map for quite a long time. Days of anxiety began to lift. He was not alone in that reaction. Many Chinese generals involved in that campaign had felt that they were fighting a confused and very chaotic battle. Japanese movements had been quite broad, rapid, and very difficult to pin down. The 9th War Zone had thrown numerous units into blocking actions, yet both well-regarded formations, weaker and improvised units had repeatedly failed to hold. After 10 days of combat, Chinese losses were quite heavy. But Japanese forces, too, had been worn, stretched, and damaged. Only now, as the Japanese reached the apparent culmination of their advance, did the 9th War Zone begin to recover its rhythm. Chaos did not disappear, but it became more legible. The possibility of a more ordered counteroffensive had thus emerged. In the early hours of September the 29th, Zhao Jiping issued the order to force a crossing of the Xiang River and attack the enemy in Changsha. The preparations consumed the entire day. River crossings under combat conditions are amongst the most delicate operations in war. Boats must be assembled or found. Units must be organized into waves. Timing would matter a lot. Surprise also matters. The location of landing points matters, for that matter. The men themselves matter most of all, because they must sit exposed in fragile little crafts, knowing that the real test would begin not in the middle of the river, but once they crossed that far bank. Late that night, the division crossed secretly by boat in 6 groups. The crossing itself went well enough. The river did not betray them. The groups made progress in darkness, yet everyone involved understood that smooth movement on water did not guarantee any success. The crucial question was what waited at the landing points. It was expected that the troops going ashore at places like Datsimen would be the first to meet the Japanese. Once the battle began there, the rest of the crossing would accelerate. Chinese soldiers landed, attacked fiercely, and drove the enemy back from the riverbank. The momentum of the assault mattered. In such moments, hesitation on shore can doom an entire crossing, but aggression can seize a foothold before the defender fully stabilizes. By the time Chinese forces entered the city, dawn was breaking. Then came street fighting. Changsha had ceased to be an objective on a map. It became again what cities become during war, a place of corners, walls, alleys, debris, smoke, and sudden death. Fighting in a city strips away much of the abstraction through which campaigns are often remembered. Streets channel movement. Buildings become cover, obstacles, or even traps. While the distance shrinks, the danger multiplies. A few men behind masonry can delay many more. Noise magnifies the confusion of battle. The city itself seems to be fragmented into hundreds of separate, smaller battlefields. For Changsha, the long season of anxious anticipation finally ended in direct flame. Yet, as I think we have seen through this mini-series on the Second Battle of Changsha, to truly understand the campaign only through the struggle at the city itself would be incomplete. While the city drew attention as the central prize, another set of operations was unfolding across Hunan Hubei. Less dramatic in appearance, perhaps, but strategically significant. These were the actions of the 27th Army Group under Yang Sen. If the fighting around Changsha demonstrated the pressure of frontal battle, Yang Sen's operations illustrated another principle entirely: the stubborn, opportunistic use of weaker forces to harass, sting, and trouble a stronger enemy from behind. The 27th Army Group was composed largely of Sichuanese troops. Their presence speaks to one of the larger political transformations of the war. Republican China had long been fractured by regional militarism. Armies had often owed stronger loyalty to commanders, provinces, or local power structures than to any unified national command. Yet, the anti-Japanese war compelled a partial reordering of these loyalties. Many warlord forces, however imperfectly integrated, now turned their weapons outward under nationalist command. There were exceptions, of course. Some men, like Han Fuchu, had preserved his own strength at the cost of military responsibility and lost both opportunity and honor in doing so. But in the main, especially amongst the middle and lower-ranking officers and ordinary soldiers, the imperative of national survival overrode provincial identity. Men from distant regions marched and fought in terrains not their own, because the war no longer permitted a narrow conception of interest. Yang Sen himself was an old warlord soldier, one of those figures formed in the fractured military world of earlier decades. By 1941, he was a deputy commander of the 9th War Zone and commander-in-chief of the 27th Army Group. Along the Hunan-Hubei-Jiangxi border, he had long been cautious in his operations. At the beginning of the northern Hunan battle, his troops proved unable to withstand the force of the Japanese offensive and retreated in disorder into the mountains and forests. That fact should not be softened. They were pushed back, but retreat did not mean disappearance. This is where Yang Sen's role became quite important. Once the main Japanese forces had advanced far ahead, the troops that had scattered began to reemerge. They knew the terrain. They knew the roads, the villages, passes, and the wooden approaches. If they could not defeat the Japanese in a grand collision, they could search for openings behind the advancing columns. On September the 20th, as the Japanese main force drove into the heart of northern Hunan, Yang Sen led elements of the 4th, 58th, and 20th Armies in pursuit for an entire day. The main body of the 4th Army had already been badly beaten at the Xinjiang River line, and only the 60th Division, recently transferred from the 37th Army, remained relatively intact. That single fact sharply defined the weakness of his means. He was not pursuing with fresh and powerful forces prepared for a decisive encounter. He was pursuing with fragments, survivors, and such units as still retained some offensive potential. But the Japanese intent on rapid advance southward paid little attention to what followed behind them, and that was the opening Yang Sen needed. On the morning of the 21st, the 60th Division acted on information supplied by an old beggar. Such details often sound almost literary, but they remind us that war in China was never fought by armies alone. Villagers, refugees, peddlers, guides, boatmen participated in the circulation of military knowledge. A beggar could see what a reconnaissance officer might have missed. On the basis of that tip, the 60th Division launched a surprise attack on the supply depot of the Japanese 40th Division at Zhangjiayuan. Divisional Commander Dong Yu led the action. The Chinese quickly overwhelmed the more than 300 Japanese troops guarding the depot. Once they broke in, they discovered an astonishing quantity of material. Shell boxes, ammunition, food, medicine, gasoline, explosives, protective clothing, telephone wire, body bags, stretchers, and much more, all stacked beneath heavy canvas. For men accustomed to scarcity, it must have seemed surreal. Apparently in some excitement, Dong Yu said to his deputy commander, It's practically a department store. But its deeper significance lies in what it truly revealed. A modern army advancing deep into hostile territory is sustained by accumulation of ammunition, fuel, wire, medicines, rations, and such. To siege such a depot is not merely to take objects. It is to grasp the hidden skeleton of the movement. At once the whole division became a swarm of carriers. Officers and soldiers alike grabbed whatever they could and began hauling the captured supplies away. The scene must have been one of extraordinary improvised energy. Riflemen transforming into laborers, war reduced for a moment to the brute physical act of lifting, dragging, and carrying. They all moved like ants, dismantling a storehouse. But there was too much to remove and far too little time. Before even 2 regiments had completed the work, the Japanese returned in force. Enraged, they sent more than a dozen aircraft to bomb the troops carrying off the captured crates, while over 1,000 infantrymen rushed in on the ground. Dong Yu immediately ordered the men to abandon what remained and destroy it. Amid the deafening explosions, the 60th Division withdrew from Jiangjiayuan. The Japanese pursued quite hard, driving them back into the mountains before finally stopping. Measured purely in terms of territorial occupation, the action really changed little. The Chinese did not hold the depot. They were forced back again. But they judged in operational terms that the raid had mattered. Supplies had been captured, destroyed, or disrupted. Japanese rear security had been embarrassed. Time and energy had been consumed in response. In a campaign where the Japanese were racing south and depending increasingly on stretched lines, such harassment was not trivial. After the 23rd, Yang Sen expanded these efforts. He sent a whole division to harass the Japanese rear, while also dispatching battalions and companies to ambush supply chains and disrupt transportation lines. This was not the kind of warfare that produces neat, dramatic maps in the conventional military sense. The actions were scattered, local, opportunistic, and often inconclusive. Not every useful military action ends up in the destruction of an enemy division. Sometimes its value lies in forcing a stronger opponent to spend attention where he had hoped to spend only momentum. These operations were quite costly and uncertain. Small Chinese units striking roads and depots risked encirclement or aerial punishment. Yet they possessed one advantage. They did not need to win a grand battle. They needed only to make movement harder. On the 25th, even after the 26th and 37th Armies had suffered defeats elsewhere, Yang Sen gathered his troops that still retained some offensive capacity and launched another attack. In these actions, the 90th Division captured Wukou, the 59th Division reached the northern bank of the Mailo River, and the 60th Division advanced to Donggang, with elements of the 58th Army controlling the Yuanba-Jiangqiao Highway line by the 26th. These gains were not a dramatic centerpiece to the campaign by any means, but they formed part of the cumulative pressure on the Japanese operations. Every road contested from the rear, every convoy threatened, every depot exposed, and every forced diversion of troops weakened the enemy's ability to convert tactical advance into stable success. The battlefield was fluid enough that Yang Sen's headquarters itself had kept moving, from the Milo River northward to Pingjiang. Mobile headquarters in such conditions lived under constant uncertainty. Reports arrived late or contradictory. Rumors outran facts. The front could bend in unpredictable ways. A command post that seemed safely behind the line in the morning might, by the afternoon, lie only a few kilometers from enemy forces. Yet they knew how dangerous their situation often was. Sometimes they were only a few kilometers from the main Japanese forces. Years later, Mao Jianyin, who had served as an operations staff officer under Yang Sen, recalled the old commander's outward behavior in these dangerous days. Yang Sen, as Mao remembered, was always joking with the people around him and could still laugh and talk during battle. On one occasion, he even joked with his bodyguard about putting chili oil in his tea. To younger staff officers, this behavior appeared almost absurd. Yet they still knew how dangerous their situation often was. Sometimes there were only a few kilometers between them and the main Japanese forces. There is more than just an antidote in this memory. Old commanders often cultivated a style of ease under danger, not because they felt no fear, but because they believed visible calm itself was part of the command. Men take emotional bearings from those above them. A commander who panics spreads panic faster than an enemy breakthrough. Yang Sen was about 60 years old during the Second Battle of Changsha, and he liked to remark that he was actually 5 years older than Chiang Kai-shek. Age had not removed him from the front. His function in the campaign was not to shatter the enemy in one decisive frontal blow. It was to persist, reappear, sting, and remain troublesome. His 27th Army Group would follow the Japanese all the way to the outskirts of Changsha. They did not fight many large set-piece engagements. That was never their main value, but the Japanese could not ignore them. If Japanese units turned and tried to hit them directly, they tended to dissolve into the landscape. If the Japanese pushed on and ignored them, they reappeared to sabotage roads, hit supply lines, and create alarms in the rear. Even official Japanese histories later described them memorably. They called them like a swarm of annoying flies. And the phrasing wasn't meant to be contempt. But as so often happens during war, an insult becomes an accurate description of the effect. If these Chinese troops could not be tigers in formal battle, they could still become intolerable as flies. Under certain conditions, fatigue, heat, uncertainty, stretched supply, shaken morale, flies can become more oppressive than an enemy would like to admit. When later generations look back on the campaigns, they often search for a single explanatory image. But the fighting of September 1941 resists reduction to one symbol alone. What gives a campaign its force and memory is not one isolated episode, but the convergence of several pressures all at once. A city under threat, a command trying to coordinate multiple fronts, exhausted reinforcements thrown directly into battle. Japanese forces advancing quickly but becoming increasingly vulnerable the further they pushed, and Chinese troops in the rear refusing to disappear after defeat. Seen from Chongqing, the campaign was a matter of telegrams, maps, and the management of strategic risk. Seen from the front, it was a matter of thirst, mud, broken fieldworks, sudden bombing, exhausted marching, and the uncertainty of whether the next order meant reinforcement, retreat, or death. Seen from the Japanese side, it was initially an aggressive advance towards an important objective, but one increasingly troubled by stretched supply, difficult terrain, and persistent reappearance of Chinese forces behind the line of movement. At the same time, the campaign reveals a Chinese war effort that had become more resilient than in the earlier years of the conflict. The Japanese advance towards Changsha was dangerous and, at moments, appeared close to success. Chinese blocking forces suffered severe defeats. Units arrived exhausted and they were hurled into action all at once. Commanders lost men at devastating rates. Changsha itself briefly fell into enemy hands, and yet the city was not simply surrendered, as an accomplished fact. Chinese forces regrouped. Orders were coordinated across war zones. Reinforcements marched at desperate speeds. Counterattacks were mounted. Forces west of the Xiang River prepared and crossed back into the city. Elsewhere, troops under Yang Sen gnawed at the Japanese rear and made advance more costly than a map of the front lines alone might suggest. This combination of desperate frontal resistance and insistent rear harassment was one of the characteristic strengths of China's resistance in the stage of the war. China could not always match Japanese power in one concentrated blow, but it could absorb, delay, fragment, and trouble that power across space and time. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. If after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/Pacific War channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, get early access to all the content I make, and voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. In late September of 1941, Japan pushed deeper into China, but Chinese forces, supported gradually by international help, kept resisting. Changsha in Hunan became the central point of the conflict, seen as vital to the strategic control of southern central China. Meanwhile, elsewhere, in Hunan and Hubei, Yang Sen's 27th Army Group, often using smaller, opportunistic actions, reappeared behind Japanese lines to disrupt their depots and convoys.